Cellular respiration, y'all. Let's do this. This is the last set of notes for, or the video, the last part of the video note series. So let's dive right in. So we've already talked about the photosynthesis and the Calvin cycle and a little bit about the electron change transport. We're going to go into more detail there. So cellular respiration is how all cells get energy. For eukaryotes, it's a little bit more organized. There's a lot more enzymes involved, more organelles and plasma membranes and all that deliciousness. So here we go. I gave you these two pictures. These are both really nice overviews of the entire process. So this whole process is cell respiration. It is broken down into different sub-processes. So the first one is glycolysis, and then the Krebs cycle, which is also known as the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain, which also involves oxidative phosphorylation. And then fermentation is also part of this. So let's kind of go through a quick overview, and then we'll go into each part in a little bit more detail. Okay, so these are two different diagrams, and I like that they just show different things. They both show the mitochondria, or the mitochondrion, pardon me. Mitochondria is multiple, chondrion is singular. Trying to think if that's Greek or Latin. It sounds more Greek because Latin is data, datum, etc. Anyway, excuse me. Thylakoid is definitely Greek. That sounds super Greek. Anyway, so we have a mitochondrion, and you can see the double bilayer. So you have the outside is the first membrane level, and then the next one creates all these folds that increase surface area, which is super important. So the first thing that happens is glycolysis. Glycolysis happens outside the cell. That's shown a little bit better, I think, in this diagram. And glycolysis in and of itself creates ATP. So even without mitochondria, you can still produce a small amount of ATP just from glycolysis. Glycolysis, the basic process is that it breaks glucose down into two pyruvates. You probably don't need to know that, but it might not be a bad idea if you hear the word pyruvate. Hopefully you associate it with cell respiration. I don't think it's a super memorizing kind of thing. Anyway, those pyruvates are what actually enters the inside of the mitochondria. And the inside the mitochondria, the pyruvate is then converted to acetyl-CoA. Probably don't really need to know that, but it's a thing. And that's what actually enters the citric acid cycle. Some of the products of the citric acid cycle itself will produce some energy, but some of the electrons that are gained from the citric acid cycle then go through the electron transport chain, which creates even more energy. Overall, this one is kind of cool because I like this one because it also showed that amino acids and fatty acids also can enter the citric acid cycle and this whole process. They don't involve glycolysis. Glycolysis is just for glucose. But I'd always thought about that, right? Because carbohydrates and proteins and fats all give you calories. So meaning that we can eat those things and get energy out of them. And I kind of had always thought about what the actual process was that allowed that to happen. And it turns out it's all just the same basic process, but these different molecules enter the cycle in different places. And there's probably a bunch of steps ahead of time to get those molecules cut down and into the right shape and converted into the right form to enter the cycle. But yeah, that's where all the energy comes from. So it doesn't really matter if it's a protein, which is amino acids, or fats, which is fatty acids, or carbohydrates, glucose. Those are your three sources of energy, and they all enter this cycle and this process one way or another. Okay, so the overall mechanism, what we can see here is that this kind of keeps track of where the ATP comes from. So glycolysis and the citric acid cycle can actually make 4 ATP, 2 ATP each, but the vast majority comes from oxidative phosphorylation. that's 28. So of the 32 ATP that are generated from this cycle, and I believe that it's coming from one molecule of glucose. So one molecule of glucose equals 32 ATP, which is crazy. I will say this is what that means. All of that energy indirectly came from the sun. It all indirectly came from photosynthesis. So pretty crazy. Yeah. Anyway, at least for us. Yeah, that's nuts. Anyway, now I'm thinking about before they had photosynthesis, where did all the energy come from? It still came from the sun or from thermal energy. I wonder what all those bacteria were like before photosynthesis. Back on that again. Oh, well, anyway. Okay, so moving on. These are great models to look back to if you want to see the whole picture. Maybe we'll come back to them afterwards. All right, let's talk about glycolysis. Glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria, and it releases energy by cutting glucose into two pieces. It also produces NADH. So NADH is something we talked about a little bit with photosynthesis. Let me double check. It might not have been NADH, it might have been NADPH. Okay, it's actually NADPH in photosynthesis. I don't think you have to remember NADPH versus NADH. They're kind of the same, they have the exact same function. In both cases, they were electron carriers. So they're moving electrons, and it's the same basic idea. Cells don't really use NADH as a power source, generally speaking, as like a battery, the same way they do with ATP, but it's sort of similar. Okay, so this process again, you can convert, recharge some ADP into ATP, recharge NAD plus into NADH, and you end up with these pyruvate molecules. So that's glycolysis. It happens outside of the cell. That would be important probably to remember. If you can remember this, glycolysis is outside the mitochondria, not cell. Although would it be outside of the cell if it's a prokaryote? I don't know. I don't think that's important, but it's interesting to think about. So pyruvate is then converted into acetyl-CoA inside of the mitochondria. Going back to here, you can see that happens here. It's kind of a sub-step. I don't think it's that important, but just in case it ever comes up, we've mentioned it. And then it enters into the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Okay, this is a really detailed, relatively detailed drawing of the Krebs cycle. It goes through all of its intermediaries. You do not need to know that. All you need to know is that the Krebs cycle takes pyruvate and it breaks it down into, let's see, breaks it down all the way down to carbon dioxide. Yeah, pretty crazy. Yeah, I'm trying to think about that. Does that mean, that probably means that you need oxygen for this step. Yeah, I think so. I'll have to double check, but I would imagine you would need oxygen. Let's see if we can figure out where it comes from. Oh no, you don't. It doesn't look like you need oxygen. You just need water. Okay, so I was just following the steps here real quick, just because it's interesting. So acetyl-CoA gets turned into something else and releases a byproduct. Then citrate, which is why it's called the citric acid cycle, because that's what citrate is. Yep, we've powered up over here. You're powering up some more NAD, recharging some NAD into NADH. You're releasing carbon dioxide there. This step also releases carbon dioxide and powers up more NADH. Then, there's another byproduct called GDP, which gets turned into GTP. It's not super important. It's actually guanine triphosphate, because adenine as opposed to adenine triphosphate. It's an intermediary. Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. It's another one of these nucleic acids, like the G in ATCG for DNA. Anyway, okay, so it also powers up FADH2, which again, it's just another one of these electron carrier intermediaries. Oh yeah, it looks like it requires water. So this cycle can operate without oxygen. It just needs the pyruvate, so it needs glucose or something like that, and water. So this cycle does need water. So that's interesting. Yes, anyway, so you create some ATP. This cycle represents one go with the pyruvate. So if you have two pyruvates, it gets to go around twice and it will create 2 ATP. The number of ATP doesn't really matter also, but it's just interesting to know. And then it also transfers electrons over to NADH and FADH2. That actually is important because that takes us to our next step. So once again, quick summary. We started off with glycolysis, breaking apart a glucose into 2 parts. It moves in through the cell into the citric acid cycle and generates some electrons that are then going to go through the electron chain transport, and it produces a couple of ATP in and of itself. So the last step is the oxidative phosphorylation, which is also known as the electron transport chain. Okay, so here's another great picture. This is again of a mitochondria. This is the space in between the 2 membranes. This is the inside. It's a bit simplified, but it does the trick. So the citric acid cycle happens in here. And as soon as any of these electron carriers, like whatever that is, succinate, which is another word for FADH2. FADH2 and NADH are electron carriers, and they bring those electrons to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, exactly the same, just like in back in photosynthesis, transports electrons through a couple of different membrane-bound enzymes. They're usually called like complex 1 and complex 2 and complex 3 and complex 4. It doesn't matter. You don't even have to know that. Just know that it's a series of proteins. And the energy from that electron transfer is used to pump hydrogen out of the matrix and into the intermembrane space to help create that proton gradient. So the concentration of the protons out here is going to be very high, and inside it will be a lot lower. And that's what that energy is used to create, to do that pumping. The same thing here, it's going through basically the same process. The key here that you now can see is the oxygen. The very end of the electron transport chain, that electron needs to be accepted by something. And in this case, it is oxygen. So in both these cases, oxygen gets turned into water here and here, and that's the end of the cycle. This cycle does not work if there isn't oxygen in order to accept that electron at the very end. That process is called oxidation. And again, it's originally because, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this before. Oxidation is when you accept electrons. Oil rig is the thing we use. Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain of electrons. And lots of things aside from oxygen can participate in oxidation, but oxygen is very good at it. So it's why it was originally called oxidation. So that's the oxidation part of oxidative phosphorylation. So this is the part where if there's no air, this step will not work. Or no oxygen. You cannot have this step without oxygen. You can still have the citric acid cycle, but the electron transport chain won't occur. Okay, so as soon as you have, this is where the breathing out of, the breathing in of oxygen is super important. The breathing out of carbon dioxide is from the citric acid cycle. So that's what, if you think about respiration, cellular respiration is connected to physical respiration. The breathing in, breathing out, but it's about way more than that. It's really about like these chemical processes, but they are connected. The reason we have to have lungs, we have to be able to breathe in and out. There you go. That's why we have a bloodstream, to get oxygen to all our cells. Crazy. Okay, so once again, you use the proton gradient is what powers the ATP synthase. So ATP synthase allows hydrogen, as the hydrogen passes through, it works very similarly to like a water wheel, actually. Water wheels do the exact same thing. You have, just turning lights back on. Water passes over the wheel and it turns the wheel, which then, creates either energy or you use it to grind grains, whatever. Same basic idea, that energy is being used to recharge ADP and turn it into ATP, which can then go throughout the cell, throughout the body, all the cells, usually within the cell, and power all sorts of great reactions. We call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell because of this. I will say from now on, that's kind of like that's a lower level explanation. Like, it's kind of a cute analogy, and I know it's a meme, but from now on, don't say it's the powerhouse of the cell. Just say it's the site of like cellular respiration and ATP generation. It's where, the citric glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation occur. We are at a point now where we can get a little more specific. I will also guarantee you on the AP test, if there's anything about mitochondria, every single AP test reader is going to see the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell over and 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 over again and again and again. And I got to tell you, if I were grading the AP test, I would get pretty sick and tired of seeing that over and over and over again. I will never get tired of people explaining any of this. I would be so pleased. So just keep that in mind. Okay, I want to go over real quick what oxidative phosphorylation actually means. So it's a really funky, like chunky word, like phrase. I get it. And if we break it down, though, I think it'll make sense. So phosphorylation refers to adding a phosphate group. So I want to go to ATP real quick. So ATP is, again, I think we mentioned this before, is adenosine triphosphate, and ADP is adenosine diphosphate. So the adenosine is referring to this adenine ribose base. So again, it's adenine ribose is the base for RNA. So it's the A from RNA. No, it's the A from the ATGU, or is it? No, it's AUGC from RNA. All those base pairs. So that's what the A. It's the A from like the AT. Yeah, but because it's ribose, not deoxyribose. Anyway, hopefully that kind of makes sense. Phosphorylation means adding a phosphate. So the way that ATP works is that all of the energy in ATP, the actual place it's stored, is in this really high energy bond between the second and third phosphate. They're all in a row and they're all connected together. Adding this extra phosphate takes a lot of energy. And so removing it releases that energy that can then be used to power other things. So it would be very reasonable to expect that the inside of a mitochondria is just chock full of these phosphates. They're just floating around so that they can be added and grabbed on to ADP. You would expect a ton of phosphates. Anywhere that a chemical reaction occurs that requires ATP, if an enzyme requires ATP, you would expect a lot of phosphates to also be floating around because they've been released. I haven't really thought about this before, but I bet there are a whole bunch of transporter like enzymes whose job it is to grab phosphates and like bring them to the mitochondria. I bet that's a whole thing. I hadn't thought about that before, but it must be true. Anyway, so phosphorylation is the process of adding that extra phosphate onto the ATP. Oxidative, going back, means like that whole oxygen accepting an electron and like oxidizing oxygen into water. So oxidative phosphorylation, while it sounds crazy, is essentially saying that between these two processes, between the electron change transport, there's an oxidative step, and then a phosphorylation by the ATP synthase. That's what oxidative phosphorylation means. If you can kind of remember that, it might even help you remember all the steps here. So oxygen is somehow involved, and phosphorylation, maybe that will connect those two. Okay, so there's that. I don't know if there's more I want to say about it, but I don't think so. I think, again, the important stuff is between photosynthesis and cell respiration, so the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, there's a lot in common. The main things in common are that they both use the electron transport chain, they both have ATP synthase, and the actual way of generating energy is basically identical. Sending electrons through, creating a proton gradient, using the proton gradient powers ATP synthase to make ATP, or to recharge ADP, phosphorylate it to make ATP. That's pretty much it. It's pretty awesome. Where do those electrons come from? Well, in the sun, for the photosynthesis, it comes from the sun, from light, and the photosystems. In mitochondria, the big difference is that it comes from carbohydrates that were made by the plants. So yeah, it's all great. It's all circle. It's the carbon cycle. Yay, carbon cycle. The plants have, plants have the Calvin cycle, which is how you make carbohydrates. The Krebs cycle breaks down carbohydrates. So the Calvin cycle and the Krebs cycle are kind of the opposite of each other in a lot of ways. Pretty crazy. So there's a lot in common with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. They're just kind of opposites of each other, but the mechanisms are almost the same. Okay, last thing is fermentation. So fermentation is a process if you don't have oxygen. So there is a word, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic means with oxygen, and anaerobic means without oxygen. The aero is like oxygen, and means without. So glycolysis can still happen. Oh, I guess even glycolysis needs oxygen, doesn't it? Let me double check something. Did I say that it needed oxygen? You know, glycolysis might need some oxygen. I didn't think about that. Anyway, glycolysis can still happen, but you still need something to receive the electrons. Normally, oxygen would take those electrons further on down the chain. So instead, something else has to grab those. And in the case of, usually there's two classic examples. One of them is lactic acid. So that's where there's a byproduct of lactic acid because it takes on that extra electron that's produced from glycolysis, or the, whatever, yeah. And the other one is alcohol fermentation. So depending on what organism you're in, fermentation can create either of these byproducts. Alcohol, of course, is classic for a lot of bacteria and yeast, which is used to great effect by human beings since like the beginning of, I mean, for a very long time. Humans were able to figure out that if you let things go bad, sometimes they produce alcohol, and that's interesting. So that's how you make alcohol, in fact. Yeah, like beer and wine are, all alcohol production starts with forcing microbes, it's usually yeast and bacteria, it's mostly yeast, but it's some bacteria as well, like a kind of combination, to live and survive without oxygen. So you seal off containers and force them to undergo, to try to survive, and they have to do anaerobic respiration, which is not ideal, but it works, and just produce as much alcohol as a product as they can until the alcohol poisons them and they all die. And that's basically what wine and beer are, as well as like apple cider and all those other alcoholic beverages. To make an alcoholic beverage a little more potent, you then take that, whatever that was, like that stuff, and then you just distill out all the other stuff that isn't the alcohol. So you have mostly then alcohol and like water and a few other things. That's how you make other things, like for whiskey, you use corn and you make this mash, which is kind of like a gross beer type substance that you can then extract, like start removing a lot of water from. And that's basically what like whiskey is. Vodka is usually made from potatoes, but it's all basically the same process. So good times. Lactic acid is what happens to our muscles, to what happens in most eukaryotes. So we humans are definitely don't create alcohol. Otherwise, if you ran a lot, you would start to get drunk, and that would be interesting. Although I'm sure it wouldn't have developed that way. I'm sure we would have just had better ways of dealing with that as a byproduct, and breaking it down. And then, anyway, now I'm thinking about evolution, and that's cool. Yeah, we produce lactic acid instead. Classically, lactic acid buildup is what you've been told is responsible for muscle cramps, like when you're running. It's when you can't get enough oxygen to your muscles in order to run properly. I think I might have read an article about how it's more complicated than that. It's actually not the lactic acid itself. It's like, as lactic acid is broken down, there's a different thing along the line that causes it. I don't know. Whether it's indirectly or directly, lactic acid is not something you want building up and just sticking around in muscles. Anaerobic respiration is not anywhere near as effective. So you don't want to do that forever. Okay, so that's fermentation. Oh God, I could ramble on so much more, but I'm gonna stop. Let's talk about, we've talked about ATP pretty thoroughly at this point, so I feel pretty good about that. A couple of other quick points just to hit on, just because they might come up. Heat production. So if you uncouple electron transport chain from ATP synthase, so you stop making ATP synthase, the production, that power, that energy could instead be used to generate heat. So that is definitely needed, because you have to keep cells at the correct temperature, and if they get too cold, that's very bad. So there's feedback mechanisms and things that will help regulate that. The entire process of ATP generation, it generates some heat anyway. There's always a little bit of energy lost to heat. So even without uncoupling this reaction, you can still have a small amount of heat. But if you need more, that's what happens. So yeah, if it gets very cold, and an organism is trying to stay alive, it's going to limit their ability to produce ATP, which is going to slow down a lot of other biological processes. So kind of interesting. Okay, last thing is this kind of definition of fitness. Fitness is the ability of organisms to just survive and reproduce. We'll talk a lot about this in context of evolution. The general rule here is the more diversity of systems that an organism has, the more it's likely, the more fitness it has, the more likely it is to survive in a whole bunch of different situations and environments. So one example of that would be some organisms are able to gain energy from multiple sources, not just glucose. That's a good thing. If you can only eat one type of food and that food runs out, that's a big problem. But if you have lots of food sources that you can rely on, that's very helpful. So that is one strategy for increasing evolutionary fitness. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. Oh, actually, I will stop there, but I'm going to show you some some YouTube videos that I would love for you to watch. I'll highlight a couple. When it comes to cellular respiration, there's a couple of videos here. First of all, there is the official College Board video. That's a classic lecture, followed with some other information that's more relevant to last year, but you know, there it is. I've got a couple of Bozeman science videos, one on how important oxygen is, one on cellular respiration here, and then there's anaerobic respiration. This one is really good. These Harvard X videos are great because they're these animations with like commentary. So this one is only 5 minutes. I would highly recommend that one. I think it's excellent. So then there's 4 of these other videos, and I don't remember which one is which, but they kind of go through the process in a lot more detail. I remember one of these 2 being exceptionally excellent. I think this one's they're similar, they maybe overlap a little bit, but they're slightly different focus. I would highly recommend watching both of these. They both go into way more detail than you need. They talk about each of the individual complexes. You don't need to know any of that, but it's a really cool visual of how ATP synthase works. So let me just kind of throw this on here for just a second. Like, that is so cool. So it really shows you how like enzymes are really biological, little biological machines. And that it's kind of cranking, it's got that kind of cranking action. So it's really exactly like, it's like a windmill. It just kind of keeps turning, like, or gears turning. It's really something to watch. So yeah. And then this one is very similar. Yeah, these BioVisions videos are amazing. That's so cool. And the fact that everything is moving and you can really see what's going on, it does a great job of showing that hydrogen ion concentration difference. So there's a lot of hydrogen ions here and much, much less out here, and how they're being driven through. And there's ATP molecules, the little phosphate being the phosphorylation, like the phosphate right there. Anyway, you guys probably, you might have been able to hear the voice a little bit, but probably not because, you know, videos. But definitely check those ones out. Let's see what else we got. These are a couple of, this one actually had to move forward. I need to move that one up. These are some TED Ed videos, and those are always a lot of fun. Definitely recommend. Okay, I will stop there, and that's pretty much the end of the unit. And now we'll just move on from here. We're going to add on more stuff. We're going to go into the cell cycle and regulation. So it's going to be more of these kind of bigger, complicated systems and getting a general gist of what's up with them. So I'll sign off for now and see you at unit 4. Oops, hit the right button.